Welcome, everyone. My speaker today is Dr. Dayna Pizzigoni, who's going to be speaking with us about some interfaith dating issues. Tell us a little bit about your work, Dr. Pizzigoni.
Sure. Thanks for having me, Dr. Gasco. My work in the counseling field, as well as when I step into the classroom as an educator, really revolves around integrating faith issues and religion and spirituality into the counseling process for all the ways in which it can really be a main source of support for folks and a way, the ways in which it can sometimes be a source of pain or conflict.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. What are some issues that you've seen that come up these days for dating with people who have mixed faith backgrounds?
Sure. Well, one of the things I noticed from the get-go when folks are dating and a person is particularly religious, they're often not sure how much to share or when to share about their faith in the dating relationship. I think there can be a lot of pressure, when you're out dating to present yourself in an appealing way and to not turn people off. And faith and religion, is one of those issues where it can be really important to someone, but there can be a lot of fear of judgment
Yeah.
and fear of people assuming, if people, one example that I'm thinking of from a person I worked with is they were nervous to talk about their faith on the first date or even to put it in one of the dating sites because they were worried that people would cross them off or think they weren't interested in anything sexual in a dating relationship because of their faith. And so those assumptions that people might have and the fears that people have can often be an obstacle just in the very beginning even.
It's a really good point. It's funny because, I'm a health psychologist and I find like we talk about that with health issues, but it never really occurred to me that that's an issue that comes up, and it makes a lot of sense with faith and dating too.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think it's funny, the more I talk to people about this project, the more I find people hide different parts of themselves as they're beginning to date, when actually it could be really advantageous to just put it out there.
Absolutely.
Yeah, what are some challenges that come up in interfaith dating or even interfaith couples that, excuse me, you don't see as much coming up when that's not necessarily an issue, or maybe in more secular couples?
Sure. Well, kind of piggybacking off of the part we were just discussing where a person might not talk about their faith early on in a dating relationship, I think a challenge that can come up for people is that they might mention their faith in passing, in the initial kind of phase of dating. And then down the road, maybe a couple, is really feeling really great about one another. Maybe they're falling for one another. And then the issue of faith can come up in a more serious way. And I think something that can happen in interfaith dating is the partner who is not religious or is of a different faith might be polite, might be kind of hesitant to share how they really feel. And it can get sticky kind of quickly because in general, I think in our culture, kind of this dominant North American culture, there's a lot of hesitancy to talk about religion and to talk about faith. And so people don't really have a lot of practice navigating how you even talk about it.
Yeah.
So if someone says something, like, well, maybe something kind of more broad, like nature is really important to me in my life, or I really enjoy, sports. And then it's kind of this easy conversation that can be had. Whereas if someone says, my faith is really important to me, the other partner might just be polite initially and say, absolutely, I'm not of that faith, or I'm, don't consider, spirituality important in my life, but I completely respect that it's important for you. And so it can be navigated in a way that seems really respectful and polite, but down the road, it can really be an issue, when someone wants to get together, let's say it's a person who's Christian, someone wants to get together on a Sunday morning and because the partner wants their family to meet the other partner.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's a conflict about going to church. or, how a person might really practice and really keep holy their Sabbath when the other partner's family's in town. And all of a sudden there's a conflict that really wasn't talked about or predicted or discussed, just because there's a lot more practice with not talking about religion than there is talking about it.
So you mentioned some issues with family and friends. What are some tips that you have in terms of managing issues that come up in interfaith couples or interfaith dating with family and friends?
Sure. I think talking about issues that might come up with family and friends is really important between couples. And my recommendation is always for folks to be able to practice talking about it without apology, right? Like, think about it as something else, that's really important and sacred in your life, and put it out there on the table. So, for example, if a couple decides that their dating relationship is going really well and they want to move in together, then the conversation needs to be had. If one of the partners has a family that's very religious, well, what will we do when your family comes into town and they're not okay with couples living together before, they get married? So, okay, what will that look like? Does that mean I have to pretend not to live here the weekend that they're visiting? Do I need to move my stuff? How do we talk about our lives? And 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 then have that conversation about what feels comfortable for that couple. How much do they want to edit or not? And then what are those sort of sticky conversations that might come up, and how do you navigate them? And I think, it's interesting because I have, you can work with folks who are doing kind of more traditional interfaith dating. So perhaps one person is Catholic and another person is Jewish. Or perhaps someone grew up in a Muslim country and are now in the United States, and so they maybe don't practice, but their family is both very culturally Muslim and practice Islam in a very serious way.
Mhm.
So then, how will they navigate those holidays? When Ramadan comes, what will that look like? How will the other partner participate or not? And, I think those pieces of how do you navigate those traditional relationships that are interfaith are important to navigate in a forthcoming way. And I also think pieces where there might be someone who's spiritual and not religious that, you know, might seem to be less of a point of conflict is still something really important to talk about. Because if my yoga practice keeps me sane, and we'll use the same example, your family's coming into town and we're kind of trying to plan, and all of a sudden we have a conflict because I'm not willing to move that yoga practice in the morning, or that, you know, even my 12-step meeting. I think people forget that there's a lot of spirituality in that. And I think it's sometimes easier for people to honor, okay, your recovery is important, but there can be this kind of idea of like, well, do you have to go to a meeting on Saturday night when my family's in town? And it's like, well, this is my church. This is what I, practice to stay grounded and stay connected to a power greater than myself. So I think there's a real important piece for couples to talk through these issues in a way that is forthcoming, like I mentioned, and putting aside the polite, not to erase courtesy, but to really have the hard conversations early on, whether it's navigating family and friends, or whether it's navigating the preciousness of time and where time will be spent and how.
Yeah, great. Thank you. We had also talked about the idea of kids, of settling down, and where that comes up in dating. And I think that's particularly something that can affect interfaith couples and interfaith relationships. And that can be really challenging to navigate too. What are your thoughts on that?
Sure. Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. The how to navigate family and friends in particular can be actually challenging if a couple decides to raise a family. And I think when you're discussing how to raise children, whether it's in a particular faith or not, it's important to really talk about those wider family conversations that you'll have to have with family of origin, and also really come up almost with your own framework of faith. So some people do this really well. I know someone who was raised in an interfaith family where, one parent was Baptist and the other parent was Jewish.
Mhm.
And she really was raised in a blend of the two.
Mhm.
So there's a certain amount of openness that a couple can have in really how to navigate balancing faiths, and a certain amount of commitment to almost creating this new religious or spiritual context that the family will be raised in, so that you have language to navigate with your kids how to practice both faiths, how to respect different values. And in some ways, there's a gift today because we live in a pretty pluralistic society, where there are, there's a great diversity of many faiths, and also a lot of people who practice many faiths. Um, there might be someone who, thinking of another person who, is culturally Jewish, but really is invested in Buddhism and can find a lot of really easy overlap there. And then there's other areas that are, can be a lot more challenging. But what I like to really share with folks is to really think about a new context, a new frame of thinking, and practice your own way of talking about these things with your kids and with your family. And in that way, you're not kind of using just one set of language and one partner's faith is deprioritized, but you're kind of creating a new language. It's almost like being bilingual in a family.
Yeah. One of the things, as we were preparing for this interview and we were sort of going back and forth, that you mentioned too was that it comes up a little late for people, too late a lot of times. And that seems like a tricky or a sticky issue.
Exactly. Yes. It comes up too late. And also, it's not discussed enough. So let me give you a really practical example. So maybe, and this actually came up with a couple that practice the same faith, technically,
Mhm.
but they live that faith out really differently.
Right.
So if one person is really committed to religious ceremony and sacrament and tradition or ritual,
Mhm.
and the other person, maybe believes the same thing but doesn't commit in the same way, what can happen is there's not enough conversation early enough that really talks through, what will family life look like? Or what will that couple's life look like down the road? So maybe I am totally happy, you know, going to mass every Sunday by myself because that works, for me.
Mhm.
And then all of a sudden, a couple might be building a family and they didn't really think through, well, okay, so Sunday mornings, are you going to take the kids by yourself to mass, if they're
Mhm.
Catholic? And what will that look like? And there can be some resentment that's built up
Yeah.
if a couple doesn't talk about these concerns early enough in the relationship in a way that the other person is really prepared to get on board. I think in dating in general, and down the road, if a couple chooses to be married, there's a lot of compromise and sacrifice that
Yeah.
is just built into relationship. So, maybe a woman and her wife are talking through various compromises on different aspects, where to live, how to navigate family. And the one piece that is kind of missing is faith.
Mhm.
And then when the issue of compromise comes up, there can be a lot less willingness for a partner to compromise on something that is part of their spiritual life or part of their faith. And, another partner can really get defensive about that or feel like all of a sudden they lost their teammate. And I think that experience can really be prevented if these conversations happen early on. And if partners can really honor that there might be an area of faith where someone's not willing to compromise on,
Yeah.
whether it's a ceremony or a tradition or a holiday. And then the person, who's not engaged in that same faith really needs to honor that without resentment as much as they can.
Yeah. I so appreciate you talking about it. It sounds like a lot of the issues are around talking about it early, talking about it more in depth, and sort of finding these navigations together. I love you kept using the word commitment, and that feels so important in all of this. Thank you so much for taking the time for talking with us today. Where can people who are interested in hearing more about you and your work find you?
Sure. I think the easiest thing is really Psychology Today. I have a really concrete, simple post on that directory. And if you go on Psychology Today and just type in Dr. Dayna Pizzigoni, you can find me there. I spell my first name Dayna, so that's pretty unique and helps people, I think, when they're having some trouble with the Italian last name. And I practice in media, but am doing telehealth right now, so I can support folks, in PA, in different areas of PA right now, which I'm grateful for.
Great, thank you so much.